On the morning of June 1, 2026, a sealed brown envelope appeared on the desk of Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra inside the Apostolic Palace. It carried no return address, no postmark, and no stamp. For 11 minutes, he did not touch it. When he finally opened it, he found 31 pages of names, transfers, meeting records, photographs of handwritten notes, and a sentence that turned the document into a direct challenge to papal authority. The Pope did not control the Vatican. Peña Parra stopped reading at page 9. He locked the dossier inside his personal safe, walked directly to Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and entered without knocking, breaking a habit he had followed throughout decades of service. Within hours, Cardinal Kevin Farrell was called into a private room. The document was placed between the three men, and a question entered the center of the Church's government. Was the dossier a fabrication designed to destroy them, or proof that an internal network had been controlling money, appointments, and information for years? Before this investigation moves deeper inside the Vatican, subscribe to the channel and stay with the story. What followed was not a debate about reform, reputation, or public relations. It was a test of whether Pope Leo XIV truly governed the institution he had been elected to lead, and whether the men named in those 31 pages would surrender their power before he took it from them. On the morning of June 1, 2026, a sealed brown envelope was placed on the desk of Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra, the substitute of the Secretariat of State, and the official responsible for the Vatican's daily internal affairs. It had no return address, no postmark, and no stamp. No messenger had been announced, and no delivery had been entered into the normal chain of protocol. The envelope had simply appeared inside the Apostolic Palace, as though it had passed through the marble corridors without being seen. Peña Parra stared at it for 11 minutes before opening it. He later told a colleague that he had already sensed something was wrong, not because of any visible mark, but because of the weight of the envelope and the texture of the paper. It did not feel like ordinary correspondence. It felt like a weapon wrapped in silence. Inside was a dossier 31 pages long. It contained names, dates, records of financial transfers, meeting logs, and photographs of handwritten notes. On the first page, one sentence had been typed in bold. The Pope did not control the Vatican. They did. Peña Parra continued reading until page 9, then stopped because his hands had begun to tremble. He closed the dossier, returned it to the brown envelope, and placed it inside his personal safe. He did not summon an assistant, request an internal review, or send a written message through the Secretariat of State. Instead, he left his office and walked directly to Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State and the most powerful diplomat in the Catholic Church. When he reached the office, he entered without knocking. That single action told Parolin that normal procedure had already failed. In 34 years of curial service, Peña Parra had never once entered a room without first asking permission. He was known as a man of protocol, restraint, and exact procedure. Now he stood in the doorway carrying the expression of someone who had seen something that protocol could no longer contain. "Read this," Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra said. He placed the envelope on Cardinal Pietro Parolin's desk. Parolin opened it and read the first page, then the second. After that, he skipped to page 14, and then to page 27. He set the dossier down and removed his glasses. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Peña Parra answered that he did not know. When Parolin asked who else had seen it, Peña Parra told him that no one had seen it, except the two of them. Parolin leaned back in his chair. His expression remained unreadable. Then he picked up the telephone, dialed a number from memory, and spoke only 4 words. "We need to meet." The call went to Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, and the prefect, responsible for the laity, family, and life. Farrell had served in that role since 2019. Before that, he had spent decades in the United States, including service as Bishop of Dallas. The source describes him as a man who understood institutions and how they could be corrupted from within. That afternoon, Parolin, Peñapara, and Farrell met in a private room in the Domus Sanctae Martae, where Pope Leo XIV lived, and where many senior Vatican officials kept rooms. No assistants were present. No secretaries entered the room, and no recording devices were used. The dossier lay open on the table between them. "This is either a fabrication designed to destabilize us," Parolin said, "or it is the most dangerous document produced inside these walls in 50 years. Farrell continued reading in silence. Then he pointed to a section on page 11. It referred to transfers routed through a shell entity in Luxembourg. Farrell said he had seen references to that entity before. He connected it to the investigation involving Cardinal Angelo Becciu 2 years earlier. Becciu's trial had lasted for years and ended in a mistrial after procedural errors were exposed. According to the source, many believed the proceedings had been deliberately sabotaged so that he would never be convicted, but would also never be fully cleared. The affair had consumed the Vatican for nearly 4 years. It involved a London real estate deal, hundreds of millions of euros in losses, accusations of embezzlement, and intermediaries operating between Rome, London, and Australia. Pope Francis had removed Becciu's cardinal privileges in 2020. The trial later became, in the source's description, a spectacle and a carefully orchestrated failure. "If these transfers are real," Peñapara said, "then the Becciu trial was not just mishandled, it was managed." Farrell asked who had managed it. No one answered. The dossier gave its answer on page 19. Page 19 described a group of 7 senior officials operating inside the Holy See. The group included 3 cardinals, 2 archbishops, and 2 heads of Vatican financial bodies. They had no official name, no bylaws, and no charter. According to the dossier, they had been working as an informal network for more than a decade. They communicated through intermediaries and used encrypted messaging applications registered to prepaid telephones purchased in Switzerland. They met in person only twice each year. Those meetings took place outside Vatican territory, usually in a private villa near Lake Como, and occasionally in an apartment in Geneva. Their purpose, according to the document, was to control the movement of money, appointments, and information inside the Vatican. The dossier did not describe the network as ideological or theological. Its objective was institutional and bureaucratic power. It allegedly influenced the appointment of apostolic nuncios in Latin America and Africa. It also redirected funds from the Institute for the Works of Religion into investment vehicles that produced returns later funneled back to allied dioceses. The same network was accused of blocking internal audits ordered by Pope Francis during the final 3 years of his pontificate. Its strength did not come from dramatic secrecy. It came from the ordinary appearance of each decision. A transfer could be delayed, an appointment could be recommended, and an audit could be postponed for technical reasons. Each action, viewed alone, could be explained as routine administration. Taken together across more than a decade, they formed a pattern. The dossier presented that pattern as a system of control. It was a system designed to operate through normal procedure, rather than open defiance. Pope Francis, who had died on April 21, 2025, had known that something inside the Vatican was wrong. He had pushed for financial transparency, created new oversight bodies, and demanded accountability. According to the dossier, those reforms had been absorbed and neutralized. The resistance had not come through open defiance, but through the slow and deliberate mechanics of an institution that knew how to wait. Pope Francis had moved quickly. The network had moved slowly. Inside the Vatican, slow movement had given delays, technical objections, postponed audits, and routine administrative procedures enough time to weaken the reforms. The dossier presented that contrast as the reason the network had survived the final 3 years of his pontificate. The question now hanging over Parolin, Peñapara, and Farrell was whether the same network remained active under Pope Leo XIV. Farrell closed the dossier and said that the Holy Father needed to see it. Parolin hesitated. He warned that if they brought the document to the Pope and it proved to be a fabrication, they would cause enormous damage to him and to the institution. Farrell answered with the opposite danger. If they did not bring it to the Pope and the allegations proved true, they would be complicit. The word landed with the force of every scandal the Church had absorbed, every report buried, every accusation deflected, and every internal investigation that had quietly ended without findings. The Vatican had survived for 2,000 years in part because it understood the power of silence. But Farrell was saying that silence carried a cost, and they were about to pay it. By the evening of June 1st, Cardinal Pietro Parolin had requested a private audience with Pope Leo XIV. The request was unusual because Parolin normally met the Pope on a fixed schedule every Monday and Thursday morning. An unscheduled meeting on a Sunday night carried its own meaning. The Pope understood signals. Robert Francis Prevost had been Pope for just over 13 months. He was the first American to hold the office, born in Chicago and raised in a working-class neighborhood, before studying at an Augustinian seminary and entering religious life. He later spent years in Peru, served as Bishop of Chiclayo, and was appointed prefect of the dicastery for bishops by Pope Francis in 2023. His election on May 8, 2025, had surprised people inside and outside the Church. Those closest to him described one quality that distinguished him from many of his predecessors: an instinct for deception. The source did not claim that he practiced deception, but that he could recognize it. During his years in Peru, he had worked inside a political environment where alliances changed quickly, and loyalty could disappear without warning. He learned when people were telling him what they believed he wanted to hear and when procedural language was being used to conceal something. He had also encountered corruption at the diocesan level. He had seen money disappear between bank accounts and construction projects, watched capable priests pushed aside for asking difficult questions, and seen mediocre administrators promoted because they remained silent. Those experiences had not made him cynical. They had given him clarity. He understood that institutions did not corrupt themselves. People did. Specific people made specific choices for specific reasons. That understanding of standing entered the papal study before Cardinal Parolin said a word. At 9:15 that evening, Parolin entered the study, while Pope Leo XIV was seated at his desk, reading a briefing on the upcoming synod. The Pope looked up and saw the envelope in the Secretary of State's hand. He also saw the expression on Parolin's face. "Sit down," he said. Parolin sat and placed the dossier on the desk. He explained that it had been delivered to Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra that morning and that its source was unknown. He said that he and Cardinal Kevin Farrell had reviewed it. Its contents, he warned, were either profoundly important or profoundly dangerous. The Pope opened the dossier and began reading. He moved slowly through the pages, turning each one with deliberate precision. Parolin watched him from across the desk. For the first 12 pages, the Pope's expression did not change. On page 13, it changed. The page contained a photograph of a handwritten note. The handwriting was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the upper levels of the Vatican. It belonged to a cardinal who remained active, influential, and trusted by many. The note contained 3 instructions: delay the audit, root the Milan transfer, ensure that the apostolic nuncio appointment in Bogotá proceeded as discussed. Pope Leo XIV placed the page on the desk and looked at Parolin. He asked how long Parolin had known about it. Parolin answered that he had known since that morning. The Pope told him that this was not the question he had asked. His voice remained quiet, but the pressure in it was unmistakable. He wanted to know how long Parolin had suspected that something like the network described in the dossier existed. Parolin did not answer immediately. The silence continued for nearly 30 seconds. Then Parolin admitted that rumors and whispers had circulated for years. There had been nothing concrete, nothing he could have taken to Pope Leo XIV or to Pope Francis as evidence. The Pope answered that evidence now existed. Parolin corrected him carefully. What existed was a document claiming to be evidence, and it had not yet been verified. Pope Leo XIV closed the dossier. He rose from his desk and walked toward the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. At that hour, the square was empty beneath the golden light cast across the basilica. He remained there for a long time before speaking again. When Pope Leo XIV finally spoke, his voice was no longer the same. It was not anger. It was something harder and more controlled. He ordered the Auditor General to appear in his office at 7 a.m. the following morning. The Pope demanded a complete list of every transaction from the Institute for the Works of Religion that had been flagged for review during the previous 4 years. He also ordered Cardinal Kevin Farrell to begin a discreet inquiry that would report only to him. Parolin warned that if news of the investigation reached the people named in the dossier, they would know that the Vatican was moving against them. The Pope answered that if the information reached them, the officials who panicked would reveal themselves. That night, Pope Leo XIV did not sleep. According to a member of his household staff who later spoke to a trusted journalist, he read the dossier 3 more times. He cross-referenced the names against the Vatican's internal directory and wrote notes in the margins with a red pen. By dawn, papers covered his desk and the pen had run out of ink. On the morning of June 2nd, Alessandro Cassinis Righetti, the Auditor General of the Vatican, arrived at the Apostolic Palace at 6:45. He was 15 minutes early for the meeting. Monsignor Leonardo Sapienza, the regent of the papal household, met him and escorted him directly to the Pope's private study. They bypassed the usual waiting area. The Pope was already seated when Righetti entered. The dossier remained on the desk, but another folder covered it. Righetti had not been told what the meeting concerned. He knew only that the matter was urgent and confidential. "Alessandro," the Pope said, "I need you to pull records." He specified every flagged transaction from the Institute for the Works of Religion between January 2021 and December 2024. The auditors were to focus on transfers involving intermediary entities registered outside Italian jurisdiction. Righetti understood immediately that the request involved an enormous volume of data. He told the Pope that compiling the material could take weeks. Pope Leo XIV gave him 48 hours. Righetti repeated the deadline as a question. The Pope answered that 48 hours was not a suggestion. Righetti left the papal study at 7:20. By 8 hours, he had assembled a team of 4 auditors. The team secured access to the electronic records of the Institute for the Works of Religion and began reviewing the transactions. Before the day reached noon, the records would begin producing the first evidence that the dossier's claims could be verified. By noon on June 2nd, the audit team had already identified anomalies. 17 transactions totaling approximately 41 million had been flagged by automated systems but never investigated. Each flag had been cleared by a senior official, whose authorization code appeared repeatedly across the records. That code belonged to someone who had reported directly to Cardinal Angelo Becciu during his tenure as substitute of the Secretariat of State. The official had remained in position after Becciu's fall. For 3 years, the same authorization code had been used to clear audit warnings systematically. When the information reached Cardinal Kevin Farrell that afternoon, he contacted the Gendarmerie Corps of Vatican City. He spoke directly with Inspector General Gianluca Gauzi Braccoletti, who had led the Vatican's security apparatus since 2019. Farrell requested discreet physical and electronic surveillance on 3 individuals. He stated that the authorization came directly from the Holy Father. Gauzi Braccoletti did not ask for further explanation. He had worked under 3 popes and understood when questions were required and when immediate action was expected. Within 2 hours, the gendarmerie had placed monitoring on the communications of all 3 targets. During the first 6 hours, the surveillance confirmed the central claim of the dossier. The network was not dormant. It was active and already responding to the threat. What none of the investigators knew was that the dossier had not been delivered to only one person. A second copy had been sent on the same morning. Its recipient was one of the 7 officials named in the document. That man was Cardinal Domenico Ferrara. Ferrara was Gaudio, 73 years old, and had served in the Roman Curia for more than 40 years. In 2022, he had been appointed to lead the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. The institution managed the Vatican's real estate holdings and financial assets, a portfolio valued at an estimated $4 billion. It was described in the source as one of the most powerful and least transparent bodies in the Holy See. Ferrara received his copy at his private residence in Rome outside the Vatican walls. He read the entire dossier in 30 minutes. Then he carried it to the fireplace in his study and burned it despite the June heat. He understood that something was coming. He did not believe that every allegation in the document was true. He understood, however, that truth and perception operated as different forms of currency inside the Vatican. Someone was using both against him. His next actions would become the first direct response from inside the network. At 4 hours on the afternoon of June 2nd, Cardinal Domenico Ferrara made 3 telephone calls. The first went to Archbishop Ilson de Jesus Montanari, the secretary of the dicastery for bishops. The second went to a financial advisor in Zurich, whose name appeared in no Vatican directory. The third went to a number in Washington that belonged to a former diplomat who had served as the United States ambassador to the Holy See under the previous administration. Each call lasted less than 4 minutes. Ferrara delivered the same message during all 3 conversations. The walls are closing in. He did not know that the Gendarmerie Corps had already begun monitoring his communications. Every word from the 3 calls was recorded and transcribed. Before sunset, the transcripts were delivered to Cardinal Kevin Farrell. The surveillance had captured the first direct reaction from one of the 7 officials named in the dossier. Ferrara had received the warning and immediately reached outside the Vatican. By the evening of June the 2nd, Farrell presented his preliminary briefing to Pope Leo XIV. The evidence was becoming clearer, and the situation was worse than they had expected. The structure described in the dossier did not resemble a dramatic conspiracy. There were no midnight meetings in underground chambers and no coded messages passed beneath doors. It operated through mutual favors, shared interests, and deliberate inaction. Over decades, those relationships had hardened into a system that resembled a shadow government. The Pope and Farrell sat in the Domus Sanctae Martae while their food grew, cold on the plates. Pope Leo XIV asked how deep the network reached. Farrell answered that the evidence found by the auditors indicated that at least 4 dicasteries had been affected. Appointments, financial decisions, and even the timing of certain public statements had been coordinated. The Pope asked who had directed the coordination. Farrell told him that there was no single leader. The 7 officials operated by consensus. If one member was removed, the others could continue. According to Farrell, the arrangement had been designed to survive exactly the kind of intervention the Pope was considering. The structure did not depend on one individual remaining in office. Pope Leo XIV then raised the controversy surrounding fiducia supplicans. He asked whether it had been connected to the network. Farrell paused before answering. The question concerned Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez's declaration on blessings for same-sex couples, issued in December 2023. The declaration had created intense division inside the AO Church. Entire bishops' conferences in Africa had rejected it. The source described it as one of the most divisive moments during the final years of Pope Francis. According to the dossier, the network had not influenced the content of the declaration, but it had influenced the timing of its release. The dossier claimed that the declaration had been released to coincide with Pope Francis's hospitalization when he was least able to manage the reaction. Pope Leo XIV pushed his plate aside. He said that they would not remove only one member of the network. They would address all 7 simultaneously. Farrell warned that such an action would require extraordinary measures. Some of the men had served the Church for decades, maintained powerful allies, and held influence within national bishops' conferences across 3 continents. Pope Leo XIV answered that they also had obligations. He said they had broken every one of them. On the morning of June 3rd, Pope Leo XIV convened an emergency session of the Council of Cardinal Advisors. The council consisted of 9 cardinals from around the world. He had restructured it in January 2026 to serve as his closest advisory body. At that time, he had announced that the council would meet annually, but he was calling it back less than 5 months later. Not all 9 cardinals could arrive on short notice. 6 reached Rome by that evening. Among them were Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich of Luxembourg, Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo Bongo of Kinshasa, and Cardinal Sion Patrick O'Malley of Boston. Cardinal Pietro Parolin and Cardinal Kevin Farrell joined them and presented the findings. The presentation lasted 2 hours. The cardinals listened in near total silence. When it ended, Cardinal O'Malley spoke first. He said that if the evidence was verified, it would be the most serious internal crisis since the Vatican bank scandals of the 1980s. Cardinal Hollerich urged caution. He said they had to avoid creating a witch hunt and warned that the Church could not afford another public scandal. Cardinal Ambongo leaned forward. He answered that the Church could not afford to protect those who exploited it. The debate continued for another hour. Some argued for a slower and more deliberate approach through an internal investigation, conducted quietly over several months. They wanted time to verify every claim, build an unassailable case, and minimize the public consequences. Others argued that speed was essential because the network would destroy evidence and close ranks as soon as it sensed a threat. Pope Leo XIV listened throughout the debate. Then he stood, and the room became silent. He said that he had not called them there to debate whether to act. He had called them to tell them that he was acting and needed their counsel on how to do so justly. The Pope explained that he would personally confront the individuals named in the dossier. He would not act through intermediaries or written communications. He would meet them face to face, one by one. Each person would be given 24 hours to resign voluntarily. Those who refused would be removed by papal decree. Their cases would be referred to the newly strengthened office of the Promoter of Justice. Cardinal Parolin asked about Cardinal Domenico Ferrara. Pope Leo XIV answered that Ferrara would be first. The confrontation took place on the afternoon of June 3rd. Ferrara was summoned to the Apostolic Palace and entered the papal study at 3 hours. He wore a black cassock with the red piping of a cardinal. He had prepared for the meeting, rehearsed his defense, identified the arguments and precedents he would use, and prepared the procedural challenges he intended to raise. Pope Leo XIV stood behind his desk when Ferrara entered. He did not invite him to sit and did not offer pleasantries. He held up one sheet of paper. He told Ferrara that it was his resignation letter and that it cited personal health reasons and a desire to dedicate his remaining years to prayer and reflection. Ferrara stared at the paper. He said that he had not been given the opportunity to respond to any allegations. The Pope answered that Ferrara had burned his copy of the dossier and that this had been his response. The color drained from Ferrara's face. Pope Leo XIV told him that he had received the same document delivered to the Vatican office and had destroyed it. He then said that Ferrara had made 3 telephone calls, including one to a financial advisor in Zurich and another to a former American diplomat. The Pope told him that those were not the actions of an innocent man. Ferrara opened his mouth and then closed it. His expression shifted from defiance to calculation and finally to fear. He had spent 40 years navigating power inside the Vatican, survived 4 pontificates, and outlasted reformers and conservatives. He had never faced Pope Leo XIV under these circumstances. The Pope had already made his decision. Pope Leo XIV gave Ferrara 24 hours. He told him that after that deadline, the decision would no longer be his. Ferrara took the letter. He left without another word. By midnight on June 3rd, word had begun to spread through the Vatican. The details of the dossier were still unknown, but senior officials were moving through corridors at unusual hours. The gendarmerie had increased its visible presence near the offices of the Institute for the Works of Religion. The Auditor General's team was working through the night, and lights remained on in offices that were normally dark by 7. At 11:45 that night, a Vatican correspondent for an Italian newspaper sent a message to her editor. She wrote that something significant was happening inside the walls. No one was speaking openly. Everyone was afraid. On the morning of June 4th, Cardinal Domenico Ferrara submitted his resignation. The press office of the Holy See announced it in a brief statement that cited personal reasons. No questions were accepted. No further details were provided. Within 3 hours, 2 more resignations followed. Archbishop Ilson de Jesus Montanari stepped down from his position at the dicastery for bishops. The head of the Vatican's Financial Information Authority, a layperson whose name appeared on page 22 of the dossier, also resigned with immediate effect. 3 of the 7 had now left their positions. The remaining 4 did not resign. They chose to resist. They believed that a public confrontation could damage the Pope more than it damaged them. They also believed that the institution's instinct for self-preservation could protect them, and that the pressure of a media crisis might force the Pope to retreat. That afternoon, Pope Leo XIV met privately with Cardinal Pietro Parolin. The conversation was brief. The Pope said that the 4 officials believed they could outlast him, and that the institution would protect them. Parolin answered that in the past it had. Pope Leo XIV looked at him steadily. "I am not the past," he said. At 5 on June 4th, he issued 4 papal decrees. Each decree removed 1 senior official from office with immediate effect. Each decree cited a provision of the Apostolic Constitution, Predicate Evangelium, the governance framework enacted by Pope Francis in 2022. The provision granted the Pope Extraordinary authority to restructure offices of the Roman Curia and dismiss officials without the standard review process. Pope Francis had included the provision, but had never used it. He had believed in persuasion, dialogue, and the slow work of changing hearts and minds. Pope Leo XIV also believed in those things. He also believed in consequences. At 6:15, the Vatican press office released a statement. It said only that the Holy Father had accepted several resignations and made personnel changes as part of his continuing reform agenda. The statement used the word renewal 3 times. Inside the Vatican, the removals were understood differently. They were not being viewed as renewal. They were being viewed as a reckoning. That evening, Pope Leo XIV addressed the remaining members of the Council of Cardinal Advisors in a closed session. According to Cardinal Fridolin Ambongo Besungu, the Pope said that he had been elected to lead the Church, not merely to manage it. He said that the Vatican could no longer be run like a private corporation controlled by silent partners. The Church belonged to the faithful, and those who governed it were servants. The room remained silent after he finished. Then each cardinal stood and offered him a hand. The gesture was not required by protocol. It was their response to the decision he had made. The consequences spread beyond the Vatican. Reports from Rome described controlled chaos. The European Commission began reviewing financial flows connected to the Institute for the Works of Religion. And Cardinal Mbambo described the crisis as a necessary purification. Some praised the Pope's action, while others warned that the officials he had removed still had powerful allies. On the evening of June 4th, Pope Leo XIV returned to his room in the Domus Sanctae Martae. He opened the journal he had kept since his years in Peru and wrote 1 line. A member of his staff saw him close. The book place his hand on the cover and lower his head in exhaustion. The dossier remained locked under a papal seal. Its sender was never identified. Some believed it came from an insider. Others suspected a rival faction. And another theory claimed that the Pope had arranged its delivery himself. He never confirmed or denied any of them. In the weeks that followed, the Vatican restructured its financial oversight, appointed external auditors, and created an ethics commission reporting directly to the Pope. The 31-page dossier had opened with a claim that the Pope did not control the Vatican. After 7 officials lost their positions, the answer changed. The Pope did. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the power, history, and internal struggles of the Catholic Church.